Hello, Sam. Thanks so much for joining me. Is progress being made, do we think?
I think there is potential for it. At the end of last week, you had Donald Trump saying that the Israelis had agreed to a 60-day ceasefire. Hamas was saying, we'll take a look at it. The Israelis now see enough in it to travel to Qatar in order to join talks through third parties with Hamas, which would indicate, therefore, that Hamas are at least seeing some element of incentive for them to get behind this. And of course, it's estimated there are 20 living Israeli hostages still held by Hamas. And at the same time, 57,000 people have been killed by the Israelis in Gaza, half of them women and children. So there's a very intense incentive on both sides to come to a ceasefire. But of course, they're a very long way away from discussing any kind of longer term peace. I think one of the problems for Benjamin Netanyahu is that at least two very right-wing members of his own coalition government are threatening almost to bring the government down if they don't continue to prosecute this. I mean, they were complaining today about Smotrich, who's a minister, his finance minister, is complaining about the sending of any kind of humanitarian relief into Gaza at this time. So he's dealing with some very severe right-wingers within his own coalition. But he has been also reassured by opposition members of the Israeli Knesset that if there is a ceasefire deal, that they will back it, and he won't therefore face losing his government. I think that is an indication of how high the stakes are and how much pressure now there is on Israel to try to get to a ceasefire.
And what is the situation vis-a-vis Benjamin Netanyahu and governance and government? How much longer does he stand to run? Because I think some people are just flabbergasted by what seems like his kind of Teflon power to cling to power.
Well, Bill Clinton said the other day, didn't he, that he thought that Netanyahu just wanted to rule forever, and that his whole attitude to this. And I think it was interesting. I was in Tel Aviv during the conflict between the Iranians and the Israelis just recently, and really very senior members of the Israeli military establishment were firmly of the conviction that Netanyahu kind of needs to stay in power to avoid going to court, because, as you know, Vanessa, he's facing various corruption charges, which are easier for him to bat away while he's prime minister. So, and I've never really kind of fully signed up to that kind of wag the dog theory, but there is a lot of resentment towards him from within Israeli society for what is perceived to be his failure to get the hostages back. In the international community, he's become increasingly, and as is his nation, sadly, in many ways, a pariah nation for the massacres that have gone on inside Gaza. So his longevity in office is always questioned and in doubt. But as you say, there is something Teflon about him. One of the advantages he has is that he's completely unprincipled. So he will make a deal with absolutely anybody in order to knit together a politician, whereas other politicians in Israel actually have red lines. He doesn't, so he can get into bed with more or less anybody. So
would you say that it looks likely that this ceasefire will come about, or do you think there are so many precarious possible potential obstacles that may derail it that we can't really rely on it happening yet?
It really depends on the political will on both sides. Of course, the Israelis are demanding the complete disarmament of Hamas. That's not going to happen. Hamas will want a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. That's not going to happen. And you always get these maximalist positions, which is what they want to see at the end of a peace deal rather than a temporary ceasefire. The problem with Gaza historically is that ceasefires over the last 20 years is all that has been achieved. We've seen this not anything like the scale that we've seen recently, but we have seen Hamas attacks, Israel counterattacks, bombing campaigns, international criticism of Israel, agreement on both sides to achieve a ceasefire, a gap of a year, maybe 18 months sometimes, and then boom, it blows up again. And neither side really has much of an incentive, given that they both want to wipe each other out, to actually go towards a longer-term peace deal. So there may well be is it fair
to say that both sides want to wipe one another out? Because obviously the desire to eradicate all Jews and push them into the sea is endemic to some, as part of the central tenets of some states and some organisations, but it's not central to Israeli philosophy or belief that to do the same to the inhabitants of Gaza, is it?
No, it is central to many members of the right-wing coalition.
Yeah, but not the rest of the country and not the rest of the MPs and not many of the people who live there.
There is, or historically there has been now the polls have changed a bit, obviously because of the violence, but historically 60% on both sides always used to support the idea of a two-state solution. Now that Hamas has, been largely crushed, its support rate among the Palestinian population in Gaza is down by about 4 points over the last poll, which was about 7 months ago. So there's waning support for Hamas's, as you rightly point out, effectively a sort of genocidal approach to the Israeli state, which is that they want to wipe it out completely. As a state, they're a bit unclear as to what the human beings within that state would look at. But at the same time, the founding document of the Likud, in almost the same language, says that Israel will be sovereign from the Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. So they've both got this maximalist position in terms of the people in power, but neither group has the majority support of either Palestinians or Israelis. And I think that the general pattern here is that ultimately there would be support for return to a two-state solution. But when, that process has been dead now for probably 2 decades.
In your opinion, why do Hamas not return the 20 living hostages? Why do they not just do that and therefore bring the whole thing to an end? And why haven't they done it much, much sooner? And why don't they protect the people of Gaza from any further bombardment by doing so? Why don't they show their care for their own people by doing that?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at that question. I think it's a very, very good question. The first is that Hamas needs the bargaining position from its perspective with the Israelis. Traditionally, in the past, Israeli hostages in the hands of their enemies have been very, very powerful points of leverage. They seem to have been less problematic for the Israelis, frankly, under Netanyahu in this recent thing following the October 7th atrocities. And those atrocities were committed by Hamas in the knowledge of, or supposition that, the Israelis would gigantically overreact. Now, the Israelis have overreacted, and that suits the Hamas position, but they want to make Israel look bad, and they're quite happy to sacrifice their own population in so doing. But that doesn't relieve the Israelis of the ethical burden of falling into that trap. Killing Palestinian civilians is an a priori very bad and stupid thing to do. The fact that it happens to support the Israeli right, the maximalist extremist positions on both sides, is a moral failing of both of those groups. But ultimately, Hamas is a sort of recidivist group that will stop at nothing, and no amount of blood being spilt will. They are very public about this, Vanessa. They say, it may take a long time, and no amount of our blood is too much, if you like, until we achieve our ends. But they're not feeding human beings onto a railway track or into a sea that's raging. The Israelis are electing to flatten Gaza and kill civilians.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam Kiley, their World Affairs editor at The Independent.